brought to you courtesy of the red, white, and blue. I am a real American, fight for the rights of every man. American woman, mama, let me be free. Born in the USA.
And good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone, wherever you are. This is another installment of Mr. Eschbacher's Kitchen Classroom. Time to get with the learning, and today we're going to talk about robber barons. One of my favorite topics. Gotta be balanced here. We're going to talk about business leaders in the late 1800s, and we're going to have to make the determination. Are they, in fact, robber barons? Business leaders who use cutthroat business tactics to eliminate their competition and accumulate wealth? Or are they captains of industry? Are they pioneers? Are they innovators? Are they entrepreneurs? Guys who took a risk and just did something a little bit better, smarter, and made a lot of money. Anyway, let's get to it. When we talk about the Gilded Age, we're going to talk about the formation of corporations and corporate structures. And one of the big themes throughout this Gilded Age, now let's kind of back up and rewind here. The term Gilded Age itself comes from Samuel Clemens, aka Mark Twain, who was one of the most famous writers of the late 1800s. He referred to that time period from 1865 to 1900 as the Gilded Age because to gild something means to cover it in gold. So he wanted to basically describe the time period as extremes of wealth and poverty. This is back when sweatshop workers were making 25 to 40 cents a day, and when you had people like Rockefeller, J.P. Morgan, and Andrew Carnegie, who were giants, who could literally dictate what happened in the economy. The Civil War was a big turning point in American history. And from 1865 onward, with the end of the Civil War, America's economy began to grow rapidly. And the key to this was the corporation. Corporations were the new form of business. They were important because, and they still are important, because they can generate a ton of revenue, or what's called capital, money for investment fast. And what corporations can do that smaller businesses, partnerships, and sole proprietorships can't do is they can sell stock. And when you sell stock in a company, what you're doing is you're raising money. People are buying a share of ownership in that company. Now, granted, most of us, if we're buying stock in AT&T or whatever other corporation you want, we're a 0.000000001% owner. But these companies can sell stock, sell ownership shares in their company, and that allows them to bring in money that they can then use to expand, to produce more, to hire more people. So the corporations would grow, and that became a big thing in the late 1800s. The other thing is this idea of corporate consolidation. As time went on, the bigger corporations began to squeeze out the smaller ones, and you began to see mergers where Corporation A would buy Corporation B and they'd merge together. You would see the creation of trusts, organizations where it was like an umbrella, and this trust would have control over several companies. You would see the creation ultimately of monopolies, where one business got to the point where they had no competition in the field. We would see different types of corporate structures. Horizontal integration, which we'll talk about with John D. Rockefeller, and I bet you my crack assistant producer John will get me a horizontal integration, and I'm making a little note here, diagram to put up for you. And essentially what happens in horizontal integration is a corporation controls one step in the production of a good. So let's take John D. Rockefeller's oil. You have to drill for oil. You then have to refine it, and then you can sell different oil products. Rockefeller said, I don't care about drilling. I don't care about what you do afterward. I'm going to control all the refining of the oil. The other type of corporate structure we see is vertical integration. We'll get a diagram up there for you as well, right, crack producer John? And in vertical integration, you control all the steps in making a product. The best example is Andrew Carnegie. Carnegie was famous for Carnegie Steel. He owned iron mines. That's the ore that steel comes from. He had coal mines. You need a special type of coal called coke to be able to produce steel. Plus, you have to heat your blast furnaces. So Carnegie had iron mines, he had coal mines. Those are heavy rocks. Carnegie had his own private railroads. He had his own steel mills, and then he had companies that would turn that steel into different products like nails, like I-beams, you name it. The other big type of business structure that we see during this time period is the conglomerate. A conglomerate is a corporation that owns, well, darn near everything. The best way to explain a conglomerate, after 9/11, the CEO of General Electric was a guy named Jack Welch, and he was interviewed by NBC News, and I think it was maybe 5 years or so after, he was asked, how did 9/11 affect you personally? He said, did it affect me personally? I watched on a General Electric TV, on a station, NBC, owned by General Electric, while planes powered by GE engines crashed into towers whose office space was leased by GE corporate leasing. And you're asking me if it affected me? You know, the same company that controls your fruit juice snacks might also own beer companies, might also own razor blades. Now, one more term here in our corporate structure terminology. And again, the big goal here was to eliminate competition. Whether it's vertical integration, saying I control all the steps and I can do things cheaper than my company's competitors. Horizontal integration, where I literally just squeeze out the competitors in the production of one good. Another one was the pool. Now, we're not talking about, you know, Ron Burgundy yelling cannonball.
Cannonball!
But pools, where the railroads would do this. They would get together and they'd say, okay, look, this is your territory. I'm not going to compete with you here. This is my territory. I get this. You don't compete here. In any areas where we intersect, we're going to agree to charge the same rates. That way there's no competition. And without competition, that means bigger corporate profits. Now, when we talk about these trusts, these monopolies during the Gilded Age, understand, hands down, the biggest monopoly of them all was the railroads. Okay? As time went, railroads were the first real growth industry. They were the first source of foreign investment in America because literally they were growing every time you laid tracks down. And they were essential. If you're a farmer, you can't operate without railroads. If you mined coal or iron, you could not operate without the railroads. Everybody eventually had to buckle to the railroads, except John D. Rockefeller, who, when the railroads tried to force him into a deal he didn't like, he just built pipelines and caused the entire railroad industry to crash. You don't mess with the rock. So these railroads were, again, the first monopoly because you needed them. If the railroad went through your town became a boom town. It grew. Los Angeles, perfect example. Los Angeles became a major city in America because it's at the junction of where 3 different railroads converge. If the railroads were moved and the tracks diverted, your town became a ghost town. And perhaps no other group of people were more at the mercy of the railroads than American farmers. And in later talks, we'll get into why farmers had a tough time during the Gilded Age. But if you think of it this way, you can't get your crops to market without the railroads. As time went on and refrigerated railroads became a bigger thing, you couldn't get meat to market without refrigerated railroad cars. And these railroads could charge whatever they want, change the rates whenever they wanted, and they would do all kinds of icky things to farmers. They would jack their prices up around harvest time and say, oh boy, looks like your crops are going to spoil. They could charge more for a short trip than a long trip if there wasn't much competition in the area. They were the ultimate monopoly. And they're going to become the source of the first response by any government to try to curtail these monopolies. In the 1870s and 80s, Midwestern states began to pass what were called Granger laws. Now, the Grange, formerly known as the Patrons of Husbandry, was founded in 1867 by Oliver H. Kelly. It started off as a social club and a way to teach scientific farming methods to farmers, but as time went on, meetings would occur in rural counties in these Grange halls, and people would start to complain. They realized, hey, wait a minute, we're a bunch of little guys. We can't stand up to the big guys. But if you get all the farmers in these granges to start to vote in what are called blocks, BLOCs, then all of a sudden, if you get 100 or 1,000 little guys to vote the same way, they can have influence. And Midwestern states like Illinois and Indiana began to pass what were called Granger laws. And these Granger laws targeted two groups. One, the middlemen, the guys who controlled the warehouses that farmers had to store their grain in until it was time to sell at market. But the big one was the railroads. And these Midwestern states began to pass laws to restrict the practices of the railroads. Now understand, these railroads aren't going to sit back and go, "Ah, shucky darns, you got us." They fought back. For one thing, they'd retaliate. They'd say, "Well, we don't stop in towns that have Granger halls." Two, they took them to court. And there were two really important Supreme Court cases that you have to know. They've been on the Regents before. They've been on the AP test a ton. The first one is Munn versus Illinois, 1877. This involved the state of Illinois putting laws in place to restrict the rates of warehouses. Now, the Supreme Court ruled, okay, railroads, we get it. You are, in fact, a private business. However, you're a private business that's so essential, you're needed for the operation of people's daily lives. You're like the phone company, the electric company today. You're what's called a public utility. Therefore, state governments can pass laws to regulate you. Yeah, big win for the farmers. Woo, old McDonald. All right, in 1886, though, we get a new Supreme Court case, Wabash Railroad versus Illinois. This was a defeat for farmers in the Granger laws. Because here's the problem. In Illinois, they passed laws restricting the rates that railroads could charge. Railroads operate across state lines. They don't operate exclusively in your state. Under the 10th Amendment to the Constitution, any power is not specifically delegated to the National Government Reserve for the states. The regulation of interstate commerce is a federal power. An earlier John Marshall case in the early 1800s, Gibbons versus Ogden, Marshall Court ruled only the national government could regulate interstate commerce. Therefore, Granger laws, you can't regulate railroads because the railroads go across state lines. These Granger laws were declared unconstitutional. Now, out of defeat, you did get a big silver lining. In 1886, Congress responded. They passed a law called the Interstate Commerce Act. And in 1887, a new government agency was created, the Interstate Commerce Commission. Or the easiest way to remember it, it's the ICC. That's a really important government agency. It was the first attempt to regulate the railroads. It was like the railroad watchdog. Unfortunately, it was like a watchdog with no teeth and a leash about 2 feet long. It really didn't have much power. There were no ICC cops that could arrest robber barons who ran railroads. They couldn't even set maximum rates. All they could do was say you can't charge more for a short trip than a long trip. So the ICC was kind of weak and, well, lame until, of course, 1901 when Teddy Roosevelt became president. And as time went on, Teddy, who was, we're going to learn, is famous for dealing with these trusts, gave a lot more teeth to the ICC. All right, moving along. This was not the only attempt to try to do something about trusts and monopolies. In 1890, Congress passed another law called the Sherman Antitrust Act. Now, again, it's an attempt. It's not very effective. The ICC was vaguely worded. It always reminded me of like Kenny from South Park. In fact, sometimes the Supreme Court would, and the federal government would use it as a way to go after unions. There was a court case called E.C. Knight versus U.S. dealing with an American sugar company, E.C. Knight, and the court took such a very narrow interpretation of the Sherman Antitrust Act. They said, well, this company manufactures sugar, therefore that is not commerce. Commerce means trade, transportation, therefore the Sherman Antitrust Act does not apply. Again, it wouldn't be until Teddy Roosevelt became president in the early 1900s he's going to use the Sherman Antitrust Act, in fact, to break up 40-something trusts and regulate a lot more. Now, you might say to yourself, why wasn't the federal government doing more? Well, it's a philosophical thing. For one thing, let's go back in time. During this time period, people were big subscribers, at least the wealthy and government officials were, to this idea of laissez-faire, an idea that comes from Adam Smith and The Wealth of Nations, Adam Smith, the father of capitalism, the idea that government should keep their hands off the economy. There was also a movement called social Darwinism. People took the teachings of Charles Darwin regarding the evolution of species, and they tried to apply it to people, saying, look, it's just nature, that the strong do well, that the weak die off. My company put your company out of business. It's evolution, it's nature, it's Darwinism. I'm rich, you're poor, because I'm smarter, because I work harder. When you talk about imperialism, my country will take yours over. Why? Social Darwinism. The other big reality, though, is the federal government itself wasn't very well motivated. One of the flaws in our original Constitution was, as originally written, members of the United States Senate were not elected directly by the people. All it said in the Constitution was that the states will each have 2 senators. So state governments would appoint 2 senators. These were state governments run by rich dudes, who of course were going to appoint other rich dudes, who when it came time for making laws and regulations, were always going to take the side of the rich dudes. And this will ultimately get fixed in the early 1900s with the ratification of the 17th Amendment, which called for the direct election of U.S. senators. Some other philosophical things. There was a guy named David Lloyd Ricardo. I like to call him the Iron Man of writers. He wrote a book called The Iron Law of Wages, where he said, look, you should not pay your workers any more than it takes for them to survive. If you pay them more than that, they're just going to spend the money, eat, reproduce. You'll have more workers, and then all of a sudden the job market will crash because there won't be enough jobs. You're doing them a favor by paying them just barely enough. There was another guy by the name of Horatio Alger. Horatio Alger was, in many ways, like the propagandist for social Darwinism. He wrote over 100 what were called dime novels, short stories about the brave, the frontiersmen, the daring people, the poor little shoeshine boy who worked hard, saved all his money, and while his friends were lazy, he became a millionaire. Or the frontiersmen, the pioneers, all with this theme of social Darwinism, that you're successful because of your work ethic. In fact, wealth itself became not just a sign of work ethic, but a sign of your morality. This goes back to the Puritans, back in APUSH Unit 2, with the idea of predestination. God's going to take care of his chosen people. You can always tell who's a sinner and who's a saint, because the saints will have wealth and prosperity. Why wouldn't God take care of his own people? So wealth was a sign that you're a good guy. Now, let's talk about some fun. Let's talk about these robber barons. Again, we're talking about business leaders, and the big question is, were they robber barons, ruthless guys who used cutthroat business tactics, or were they captains of industry, guys who were pioneers, guys who just had a better way of doing things? And the first one I want to start off with is Jay Gould. Jay Gould made his money in railroads, made his money in Wall Street. Jay Gould was famous for ruthless business tactics. He had a lot of Wolf of Wall Street in him. Gould was famous for doing whatever it took to acquire railroad companies. He would famously buy telegraph and newspaper companies just so that false stories could be printed attacking how a certain railroad was being run by its board of directors, just to make the stock prices plummet. And then when he bought it, those same telegraph companies and newspaper companies would print great stories about how wonderfully managed it was to inflate the stock. Gould did other dirty stuff. Gould was famous for watering down stock. He would just keep printing out shares of stock. So you might go out and think, I've got 5% in this railroad. When the truth was, Gould sold that same 5% of stock to 40 people. You do the math. 5 times 40, that's on 100%. Gould once famously cheated out the Commodore Cornelius Vanderbilt, another famous railroad robber baron, and then almost paid for it. Gould had to hide. He and his business partner, Fisk, had to build a fort, legitimately, get troops to protect them across the Hudson River in New Jersey, because they thought Vanderbilt was going to kill him. because nobody messed with the Commodore, and Gould swindled Vanderbilt. He was often called the Mephistopheles of Wall Street. Mephistopheles is another word for the devil. Okay, the reality is I don't have a lot of good stuff to say about Jay Gould. He knew how to manipulate the stock market, bought a lot of railroads. Another guy, Gustavus Swift. Go open your fridge, look in the cold cut drawer, go to Wegmans or whatever grocery store you go to. Go check out the ham, the turkey, the hot dogs. And Philip Armour is a big influence on that. Philip Armour was a robber baron / captain of industry in the meat packing industry. Armour was the first one to realize you could mass produce meat. Not an assembly line, but a, quote, disassembly line. In fact, a lot of people think Henry Ford invented the whole idea of the assembly line. Really, it was Philip Armour and Gustavus Swift. Swift in particular was famous. Cows and pigs would come into the stockyards. They would come in the slaughterhouses. They would get put up on hooks. They'd be killed, and boom, 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 boom. They'd just be passed down the line, these sliding tracks, and disassembled. And Swift's meatpacking company, and I'm going to use him and Armour interchangeably, but Swift is the big one, were famous for canning meat. Now, this is a time when most Americans did not get fresh meat unless they lived on a farm. Remember, you don't have a refrigerator. So one of the biggest sources of meat for people back then was canned meat. And Swift used to joke, we use everything but the squeal. And they'd use chemicals and all kinds of stuff to package and can up these meats. He was the first to take advantage of using refrigerated box cars, railroad cars that were refrigerated, so now you could ship meat from all over the country. J.J. Hill. J.J. Hill is a really interesting guy. He had a wooden leg. He's a railroad magnate, railroad robber baron. He controlled the Great Northern Railroad. And he's a great example of how these guys are, again, ruthless robber barons, but also brave in some ways. Definitely, inventive. Gould, there was a great story about him one time. They were building railroad tracks out, I think, North Dakota, and the work was really slowing down. They were in a terrible blizzard. So Gould had a train car that was his office, and he stormed out of his car and demanded to know from a foreman what was taking so long, because they're supposed to be able to lay so many miles of track a day. And it was basically, the snow's that bad, we've got to shovel at first, the men are freezing. So Gould had the guys on the crew go in his office, in his car, drink hot coffee, and Gould took a shovel. I'm sorry, Gould, what am I saying, Gould? Hill took a shovel and started clearing the tracks. J.J. Hill. He was a collector of fine arts. In fact, there's a lot of art exhibits up in the northern part of the country, up around Minnesota and the Dakotas, where J.J. Hill went out of his way. I wonder how many times I said Gould. Maybe crack producer John could put a counter on that. But J.J. Hill became a famous collector of the arts. He could also be ruthless. There was a story one time where the mayor of a town came out to Gould's office, and that town had a switchyard, kind of like East Syracuse has, where you had a lot of trains, and they would hook up the cars, and if you've ever been outside, you've heard the boom, and it's incredibly loud. Well, they were hooking up trains 24/7. So the mayor came out to J.J. Hill and said, listen, I'm getting a lot of complaints from the citizens. Is there anything you can do to help me here? Could you maybe not hook up trains at night? And Gould said, don't worry about it. You'll never hear a train again. He shut down the switchyard, moved it a few miles down the road to another town, and said, now you guys can sleep and you can walk too. That's J.J. Hill. The big three for robber barons. You got Andrew Carnegie. Andrew Carnegie is the ultimate example of the Horatio Alger rags to riches story. And that's the kind of books that Alger wrote. The little shoeshine boy who becomes a millionaire. Carnegie was a Scottish immigrant.
If it's no Scottish, it's crap.
He started working when he was 13. He had a job working on a railroad as a telegraph operator. His job was just to take the messages given to him and send telegraphs out in Morse code, because railroads were a big way that you transported telegraphs right along the train tracks, you had telegraph lines. Well, Carnegie's boss would frequently disappear, long lunch, call in sick kind of guy. There was a terrible accident. So Carnegie saved the day, sent off all kinds of telegraph instructions, cleared up the mess because his boss wasn't there, and Carnegie just sent these messages out pretending he was a boss. Well, big boss, Tom Scott, found out, and he promoted Carnegie all the way up to his number 2. Eventually, Carnegie realized, as great as railroads are, there's a better industry. Carnegie went to England and he witnessed something called the Bessemer process, a better way to make steel. And he realized, look, you can't have trains without steel. You can't have tall buildings without steel. You can't have anything without steel. And Carnegie invested in better ways to produce steel. Again, this Bessemer process, and he focused on this idea of vertical integration. Again, control all the steps in the production of steel. The iron mines, the coke fields to get the coal, a private railroad, steel mills, and then factories to turn the steel products into whatever he needed. He was able to, by doing this, to save a lot of money, cut out the middleman so he could make great steel at a cheaper price. Now, Carnegie could be ruthless. In the 1890s, he wanted to break the union at his Homestead steel plant in Pittsburgh. So he had his business partner, a guy named Henry Clay Frick, lock out the workers. A lockout's like the opposite of a strike. Instead of the workers going on strike, the workers are told, no, you can't come to work unless you agree to these terms. They brought in private security guards from the Pinkerton Detective Agency. And they were going to bring in replacement workers called scabs, so that these workers who were locked out would be pressured to say, we better accept these terms, otherwise we'll lose our jobs for good. Well, the workers fought back. An actual war with fighting, gunfire. At one point, a cannon was brought in. And at the end of the day, the Pinkertons were wounded, they were captured. The workers thought, yay, we won, we're going to keep, the factory, and they won't be able to do anything with it. Well, Carnegie and Frick basically said, okay, we'll just wait you out. And they eventually got help from the Pennsylvania state government who brought the army in, and this Homestead strike was put down. In fact, or should we call it Homestead lockout? In fact, they broke the union. And there wouldn't be a strong union presence in the steel industry until the 1930s. Carnegie also did some great things. He was famous for being a philanthropist. Kind of like a Tony Stark type of guy.
Genius, billionaire, playboy, philanthropist.
Carnegie believed in something called the gospel of wealth. He wrote a very famous article called Wealth, where he said, look, the man who dies wealthy dies disgraced. That it's the duty of every person to try to become wealthy, but the wealthy need to be stewards of society. It's the job of the wealthy to do something with that money. Carnegie was famous for donating money to build libraries, universities. There's Carnegie Music Hall in New York City, because he believed the idea was you had to do something with your money. And he, by the time of his death, gave half of his fortune away. And that fortune got bigger because in 1901, our next robber baron came a-knocking. J.P. Morgan, John Pierpont Morgan. He's the opposite of Carnegie. Carnegie was rags to riches. Morgan was born rich. Morgan just didn't make steel. He didn't make oil. He made money. Morgan was the first real Wall Street tycoon.
Greed, for lack of a better word, is good.
And Morgan was the guy who controlled banks and investment companies. And when the railroads were in trouble and needed loans, they had to come to Morgan. And Morgan would get all kinds of terms. He'd say, fine, but first I have to look over your books, which is common practice on a credit check here. And he'd have people look over these railroads or other corporations and say, we could combine this with this and buy this company out. They're just not being run well. Or he would demand, hey, look, I want one of my men to be on your board of directors. And sometimes Morgan would just plain buy railroads. He would merge companies together. In 1901, Morgan approached Andrew Carnegie and said, how much money will it take to make you retire? So Morgan wrote Carnegie a check for something to the effect of $350 million. Understand, this is 1901 money. Boom. He bought Carnegie Steel. He merged it with other steel companies to make U.S. Steel, the largest steel company in the world. In 1902, Morgan became the first trust broken up, 1902 or 4, became the first trust broken up by President Theodore Roosevelt. Morgan began to buy a bunch of railroads and at one point controlled 25% of the railroad tracks in the United States. But when this new railroad trust he created, Northern Securities, was put together, this was the trust that Teddy Roosevelt sued using the Sherman Antitrust Act and successfully broke up. If you want to have one more good example of how wealthy Morgan was, in 1907 there was a financial panic. Wall Street melted down, banks were failing. In fact, the entire American banking system was in danger of collapsing. Morgan ended the panic of 1907 by basically saying, I'll guarantee every bank in America. He flexed with his checkbook. That's how powerful he was. He also was very self-conscious. He had a thing on his nose. He hated being photographed. And whenever people would try to photograph him, kind of like the paparazzi today, Morgan would beat him up and then just throw a lot of money at him. Go, there. You know, he literally was that powerful. And now, finally, it is time to talk about the most electrifying robber baron of them all. That's my lame Dwayne Johnson, The Rock.
Just some now! What The Rock is cooking!
John D. Rockefeller. You know, Rockefeller to me is like, you know, a cross between Don Corleone from The Godfather.
I'm gonna make him an offer he can't refuse.
And Mr. Burns from The Simpsons. Excellent.
Excellent.
Rockefeller starts off with real humble roots. His mom was this ultra religious, nice lady. His dad was called Devil Bill. He was a con artist. And Rockefeller grew up in this weird household and started a business as a kid selling candy just to help the family out because the family was struggling. Rockefeller realized that you could make money in oil, but not drilling oil. He looked at the guys who drilled oil and said, you are a bunch of morons. You're gamblers. You're poking holes in the ground, wasting money, hoping you find oil. And if you do, it gushes out and you eventually have to cap it, but you've wasted who knows how many thousands of gallons of oil. But oil that comes from the ground is called crude oil. It's essentially worthless until you heat it, you apply chemicals to it, you refine it. Rockefeller realized the fortune lay in oil refining, and that's exactly what he did. He opened up oil refineries, and he very quickly began to buy out his competitors to create the Standard Oil Trust. And again, this is an example of what I'd like to say he's kind of like Don Corleone. He'd come to you and say, I'm going to make you an offer you can't refuse. And what Rockefeller would do is he would offer his competitors two options. One, I can put you out of business. Or two, you can sell your company to me. It'll become a part of the Standard Oil Trust, and I'll give you two ways you can take the money. One, I can write you a check, or two, you can take the cash equivalent in stock. And he'd be very honest. He'd say, you should take the stock. It's going to be worth a lot more. But if you wouldn't sell out to Rockefeller, well, he had ways. Now, there were rumors, mind you, of competitors' oil refineries accidentally blowing up. There were stories about Rockefeller would pay kids to stake out rival oil companies, and then when people would go to the companies, follow the customers home, the next day a Standard Oil truck would come up and say, hey, listen, if you want to sign a contract to exclusively buy from us, we'll give you a special price. Rockefeller would do what was called cutthroat pricing. He would drop his prices so low he'd lose money, but he could afford to. You couldn't. And eventually you'd go out of business. Rockefeller also took on the railroads. He went to the Commodore, Cornelius Vanderbilt, again, one of the original big railroad robber baron, and he said, look, I want an exclusive rebate that nobody else gets. No written contract, simple handshake. You're going to give me this rebate, a huge percentage off. And if you don't, I'll fill somebody else's trains with oil. And he made outlandish promises. You're going to ship this many thousand barrels a day. Even though he didn't have enough oil, he said, I'll pay for it. And it just made him more motivated to take over other oil companies. Eventually, he turned on Vanderbilt. He went to Tom Scott, Vanderbilt's biggest competitor. Said, you give me this discount. And Scott took it. Eventually, Scott and Vanderbilt tried to team up against Rockefeller and say, nope, no more discounts, no rebates, no nothing. And you're going to pay this rate. So what did Rockefeller do? He said, no. Kids, now there's 3 things you don't do in life. You don't tug on Superman's cape. You don't spit into the wind. And you don't play hardball with John D. Rockefeller. Rockefeller said, to hell with the railroads. He started building oil pipelines across the country. And this caused the major railroad companies to collapse. It actually helped lead to the Panic of 1873. Now, Rockefeller's getting these special rebates that nobody else was getting. He's using cutthroat tactics. Clearly, these are robber baron deals. But even though at one point he controlled, and I want you to listen to this number, 90% of the oil refining in the United States, he didn't jack prices up. In fact, he kept them low because he had no need to. If you control 90% of the oil refining, you don't need to jack prices up. That would draw attention. And that was Rockefeller's thing. No one needs to know about our business. He would berate his executives. He'd get all over them if he thought they were being flashy, showing off their money. No. No one needs to know our business. We make our money quietly. Now, Rockefeller did a lot of philanthropic work, just like Carnegie. The Rockefeller Foundation helped eliminate diseases. He tithed. He gave 10% of his income to his church. Did a lot of charitable causes. And the reason he was so wealthy was Rockefeller had control over the thing that we as human beings crave. After air, food, and water, the thing that we need probably next is light. John Rockefeller realized the value of making kerosene. And kerosene, which is refined from oil, which is highly flammable, was the source of light for most Americans in the 1800s. Kerosene lanterns. And Rockefeller made a better product. There were tons of stories in the media about families being killed in fires because of kerosene. Even today, kerosene space heaters are really dangerous. But Rockefeller even chose the name of his trust, Standard Oil. Standard. You know what you're getting. He had high quality kerosene. It was also another neat trick. See, back then, very often you went to what was called a general store or a dry goods store, and you would go in there and you would say to the clerk, hey, I need a pound of flour. Well, you weren't getting a bag of flour. That guy was measuring flour into a container on a scale, and you had to hope that his scale was accurate or he wasn't putting his thumb on the scale to cheat you. With Rockefeller, he introduced standard-sized canisters. And you could simply say, hey, give me 1 canister of Standard Oil kerosene, and you knew exactly how much you were getting. Rockefeller, in that regard, was a captain of industry. Using pipelines instead of railroads, he's a captain of industry. Secret rebates and cutthroat tactics, robber baron. One more story about Rockefeller. John D. Rockefeller was brilliant in that he realized pennies matter. There's a famous story about Rockefeller going down on the factory floor and speaking to one of his workers. You gotta imagine this poor guy was nervous because there's Rockefeller, a guy who looks like Mr. Burns, excellent, standing over your shoulder, and he said, so tell me something, what are you doing? Well, Mr. Rockefeller, sir, I'm soldering, I'm welding your cans together, sir. Rockefeller looked and said, how many drops of solder does it take to weld one of these canisters together? I don't know, sir. I just kind of do it. Excellent. Let's play a game. Use 30 making these numbers up. Use 30 drops of solder. So the guy uses 30 drops of solder. Solder is, you heat up metal, it drops on there. It's kind of like welding glue. 30 drops, the canister holds perfectly. Very well done. Now make one using 29. 29 holds. They go down, down, down. Let's make up a number. At 13 drops, the canister's no good. And Rockefeller says it. Excellent. We have learned you must use 14 drops. You have saved me a penny. Now, take out your calculators. I'll take a lovely sip of my beverage here and wait for it. A penny on your calculator would be 0.01. Now understand something. That guy welds, I don't know, 30 canisters in an hour. So 0.01 times 30. He works a 10-hour shift times 10. He works 6 days a week times 6. He works, now this is the 1800s. He ain't getting us 2 weeks of vacation. He works 52 weeks a year. Boom. Oh, by the way, he's one of 50 guys in a factory who welds these canisters together. Times 50. Oh, by the way, Rockefeller's got 20 of these factories. You do the math. Look at that one little penny, what it ended up saving. Now, ultimately, we'll see how Rockefeller's Standard Oil Trust was broken up, but that's a chapter for another day when we get to do Mr. Eschbacher's Hero Worship of Teddy Roosevelt class. So, again, when we talk about these robber barons, I want you to think of a couple things. In what ways were they captains of industry? How were they pioneers? How were they great businessmen? How were they entrepreneurs? How were they guys who took a risk, had a better idea? But in what ways were they ruthless? Were they robber barons? Did they use dirty business tactics? Yes, they made wealth, but at what cost? And last but not least, in what ways can you compare them to some wealthy people who are famous today? Guys like Jeffrey Bezos, the guy who runs Amazon, Bill Gates from Microsoft, Elon Musk from Tesla and SpaceX. So that's your final thought. It's time now to log off and put away your chromies, homies. And until next time, I'm Mr. Eschbacher saying, go study some history.